Hello, hello, everyone joining us. So many prompt people. I love it. Right on the dot. We're gonna get started in just a minute here. Thanks for joining. Happy Thursday. If it's Thursday, I don't even know what day it is anymore, but happy Thursday. We're gonna jump in just a second. All right. My name is Kaya. I'm the Senior Marketing Manager at Seer. I'll be your behind the scenes host today. Super excited for this webinar presentation. We have a lot planned. Before we jump in, just to give you an idea of what to expect in the next hour, we have two of our creative team members here joining us today. We're going to hear all about creating really great user experiences that delight people and engage audiences. Super excited for that. As a heads up, this will be recorded, so check your inbox by tomorrow morning. You'll have the full recording in there. You'll also have the presentation deck and some additional resources that we recommend checking out on the same topic. And before we jump in, if you can just take a quick second to look at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box and a chat box. We love chat at Seer. Feel free to commentate, discuss in there as much as you'd like. The last 10 minutes or so, we're going to reserve for questions. So if you have specific questions that you want our panelists to answer live, feel free to drop those in the Q&A box and we'll get those answered in the last 10 minutes. And that should be enough housekeeping though. We're all way too excited to jump in. So I will pass it right off to you, Sarah.
Thank you. So hello, everybody. I'm Sarah, Creative Operations Manager here at Seer. I work with Andrea and the larger creative team on building processes and resources for both internal projects and external client initiatives.
And I'm Andrea Haley. I'm a creative manager at Seer. So I work on the visual design and UX and UI of things, working very closely with Sarah and with other divisions and our clients at Seer. We work across a lot of different industries, healthcare to higher ed, insurance to SaaS and e-commerce. And I'm really excited to share some insights with you today.
All right, so I'm going to jump into sharing my screen here. As Kaya alluded to, we're going to be walking through various definitions of creative and how to measure UX in relation to your KPIs. The UX building blocks, you need to create effective experiences along with some UX strategies and resources that will empower you to create experiences that both delight and engage your users. So our goal today is to show you how the building blocks of user experience, when used purposefully and intentionally, can result in ROI for your business. But first, before we get into that, we know that the term creative spans many interpretations and definitions. So before we jump into discussing user experience, we're going to align on what creative means at Seer, what it means to you, what it means at the industry, and in this webinar. So at Seer, creative is a tool that we use to construct answers for our clients' users across all digital platforms. Tactically, that may mean leveraging data-driven design thinking, UX or UI, image making, asset production, all with the goal of integrating seamlessly into paid media, analytics, and SEO strategies that move the needle on your business goals. To you, we know that there's a variety of webinar attendees today. I'm sure you may all define creative a little bit differently. So you might think of this as being artistic, thinking creatively or outside of the box, or creating designs. And to the industry, creative services typically serves as a catch-all for copywriting, visual design, user experience and interface design, or visual marketing concepts. Again, this definition casts a pretty wide net. So in today's webinar, we're going to take that wide creative net and reel it into focus on designing digital solutions that require human-centered and data-backed inputs to generate an effective user experience that results in bottom-line impact. And we'll be grounding everything that we walk through today in these definitions. All right. So we wanted to make this an interactive experience for everyone attending. So it's time for a Zoom poll. We're asking first, are you the UX and UI designer for your team? All right, interesting. I looks like a majority of you are not the UX UI resource on your team, which is great. It's love to see a mix of attendees here. Regardless of your role and level in a company, you should be championing UX. And that's because user experience impacts every aspect of your digital presence. All users are having an experience, and you all have the power to shape that into a positive and effective one for users and for your company. So now shifting into UX, let's talk about the phrase data-driven design. This has been popping up everywhere, using data as an umbrella term to support design solutions. But tangibly, what is data and how are we using that to measure design success? So at Seer, whenever we measure the success of our designs, we measure it against key performance indicators or KPIs. And this will vary by site, what your business goals may be. Maybe a user should be directed to additional article content or to a product or service page. Maybe they should fill out a form, call a phone number, or make a purchase. But many organizations are failing to link UX to revenue and are using incomplete or inaccurate information to drive their UX decisions. Nearly 10% of organizations aren't even measuring the impacts of UX changes on their site. So what people are measuring on their site and what they want for people to do on their site are not aligned. While customer experience and page engagement are definitely important metrics for you to monitor, your ultimate goal should be to eventually convert that satisfaction and that engagement into revenue and sales. So prior to implementing any UX changes, you should be benchmarking your data in relation to your specific business goals. You need to align on a hypothesis, which is what you expect the UX change to do. From there, you should be reviewing your existing data, like how far are people scrolling down your page? When do they bounce or exit? Are they engaging? Are they not engaging with key areas or pages of your site? Do you have any qualitative audience data to back up what you're seeing in the quantitative metrics? Look at how your UX stacks up against competitors with similar experiences and bring that all together in alignment with your hypothesis. From there, narrow in on what specifically you want to update, again, in relation to your hypothesis and the data you have available, and then implement that UX change and monitor its performance. And this will naturally generate a cycle of next steps, a continuous cycle of hypothesizing, testing, and iterating. And this will positively improve your UX and positively impact your KPIs, again, creating that intentional and actionable roadmap for optimizing your UX in relation to business goals. So we all want answers and we are all users. We've all visited websites where upon arrival, we're slapped with pop-ups or discount codes or a form to give away our email and our cell phone number. And who genuinely enjoys those? Typically, this is preventing us from finding an answer to a question that we have, and we will leave the site to go find it somewhere else. So as marketers, it's really important that when we put our marketing practitioner hats on, we don't lose sight of our user empathy. Our job is to help our clients and their users find solutions easier, faster, and provide clear next steps for them. And data plays into this by giving us information to design these well-constructed solutions. The data itself is not the solution. That's very important to keep in mind. The UX we're creating is the hypothesis that will hopefully lead to the solution. So our creative team at Seer pulls both qualitative and quantitative data from SEO, paid media, analytics tracking, conversion analyses, heat mapping, user interviews, competitive audits, the list goes on. It's really whatever we can get our hands on to reduce individual bias whenever we're constructing a user experience. And without these well-rounded data points, you're running the risk of compiling the wrong story, crafting the wrong solution, and then as a result, you're not seeing business gains from your updated UX.
One way we wanted to demonstrate how we've done that and how we've leveraged this data is with a case study on a client ask we heard not too long ago. So the client came to us and said that they needed new users. They needed to increase their user base and eventually drive more revenue. We interpreted that, and what we heard from it is that they needed to understand which channels provided them the greatest opportunity to sustainably increase their top of funnel traffic, and how can they best do this. So we looked at a lot of different data to understand where they were getting users, where their competitors were getting users, and what the gap was to find the biggest opportunity, because there's a lot of different levers you can pull to get more top of funnel users, and we wanted to be sustainable and have a great ROI. So a few things we explored were also with polls on the website. And what we found were for this e-commerce customer, there were a lot of top of funnel users who were landing on the website and getting e-commerce experience, but they actually weren't ready to buy. They were in a very exploration phase. So we proposed a two-pronged approach. There were a lot of SEO keywords that their competitors were ranking for that they were not. And these were generally educational terms. Think of how to and what and guides along that lens. So to immediately capture some of that, we created infographics and landing pages to get the highest value keywords up on the site really as soon as possible. But while we did that, we were also building out a long-term approach, and we went with a mobile-first blog experience. We integrated this to their current customer experience, and this provided a huge sustainable opportunity where they could continue to grow their SEO value and get that organic traffic, which is where they had the biggest gap. They were competing very well with paid. They did a lot with outreach. They needed a little bit more referral and a little bit more organic. So when we created this blog, we wanted to understand what they would need and make sure that it was holistic and sustainable. So it was a very flexible approach. They could have content of varying lengths. They could also have categories that tied into those important keywords and those rankings that they were trying to get. So we made sure to connect with the entire team and understand that these keywords would go into one category. So we needed certain filters that were going to be important in the UX side of things, and flexible templates so they could then display all this content and make it engaging. So this is what it ended up looking like. It also created a new branding approach for them. We incorporated and pushed their branding a little bit more, and this had such a great result and people reacted really well to it. So we actually incorporated some of the visuals onto the rest of their site as well. Because it was also e-commerce, we went with a mobile-first design, as most of their top-of-funnel users were mobile.
All right, so this example definitely shows that when user experience is constructed thoughtfully and intentionally, we're able to see really powerful results. So after implementing this new blog, organic revenue for our client increased 48% month over month. We saw organic conversion rate increase 20% month over month, and we saw a 19% increase in returning visitors to the blog and main site. We were able to hit our original goals of improving organic authority and traffic, along with providing a holistic and sustainable platform that can grow and continue to reach new users even after our engagement with the client ends. Within a short period of time, we started seeing organic page 1 rankings and immediate boosts in UX as we scaled our new styles and components across the main site. So all in all, our client received an updated style guide, a UI kit, user flow and sitemap, along with, of course, the blog designs themselves, on top of a sizable ROI, all from creating a custom blog experience. So data does not take the place of an experienced designer. Rather, data is arming designers with information to make more well-informed UX decisions. Your UX optimization should be tied to your primary KPIs. You should have performance baseline to identify how your new UX is performing in comparison to previous iterations. And from there, you should be monitoring and reporting on performance. This allows you to understand if your UX hypothesis was correct and what next steps you should take to harness the power of an effective user experience. So now that we've talked through that example and the impacts of intentional user experience, you might be wondering, how do the building blocks of UX add up to ROI? So I will turn it back over to Andrea again to walk through this.
Thank you. We want to get a little bit more tactical in this section and talk about some steps and some ways of thinking that you can actually implement and work with right now. So when you're thinking through a website redesign or a website launch, any sort of big experience, usually you think top down. Of course, you're going to think about the holistic experience and then figure out your page templates and your components and your elements. And this is a great approach. It's very holistic. It's very well informed, but we don't always have the luxury of doing that. And often when we're working on existing websites, we don't do that for a lot of different reasons, but it can be really easy to look at one single element and one component, and sometimes you lose track of that holistic digital touch point. So in this webinar, we're going to take that approach of looking at the single element, because there's still a lot of ways when you think about that single element and when you're looking at something a lot more targeted than an entire journey, that you can still keep the foundations and the building blocks of UX and make sure that it is still ready to scale for the entire user experience. So we're going to start with a single element, and that is going to be the button. We're using this as an example, but elements can be images, headlines, there's a lot of different things, videos, but the button is so important to me because it's usually the cornerstone and the final ask for a user. Think about any sort of checkout experience. If you're signing up, anytime you want a conversion, you're going to have a button, which is why it's so key. The good thing is that people love pushing buttons. They just love it. It's just really satisfying to push a button, whether it's in person or on a website. And if it's a great experience, you might remember it. But usually you go through your day and not even realize how many buttons you press. The internet users in the US estimated visit 130 web pages a day. That's a lot that you're just going through, you're clicking links, you're clicking buttons, and you're moving around the page. So until it interrupts your experience, a lot of users are not going to notice pushing a button or clicking a link. But when you do notice it is either when it's a very delightful experience and something wonderful happens, or when it's unfortunately a very bad experience. So a bad experience is often when the results do not align with a user expectation when they're pushing that button. Something unexpected happens. Either they're signed up for something they don't want to, they go to a web page that they don't expect. Maybe there's a pop-up or an additional step that they didn't understand was going to happen. But if it's really all about that expectation and alignment. So there's very little reason that people will abandon your website. It happens really quickly. This day and age, we know that people are ready to move on very quickly. So if you lose that expectation and you misalign your experience, they're going to leave your website and they might go to the other 129 web pages that they're ready to visit that day. And we don't want that to happen. So when you think about your button designs, it should be very purposeful. And there's a shared language that happens throughout websites and throughout experiences. And you should tap into this shared experience. If you think about a floppy disk, not a lot of users these days know or have used a floppy disk, but a lot of people still understand that that means save. So when you think about that terminology and some of those shared languages, you should utilize that and make sure you're using icons that match up and language that matches up. So this is just an example of a lot of different types of buttons there are, and you can style them in a lot of different ways. So for example, the corner radius can be very sharp or it can be rounded. And there's been studies that have shown that rounded is a little bit more friendly. People like the rounded approach, but it might not always be appropriate. So maybe you want to have a little bit more authority to your buttons, or you want a very minimal design. Then the corner radius you would have set to 0. Same with the floating action button. This is like a chat that's following you down the page on the right-hand corner. That's the expected placement of those buttons. And users enjoy it more when it's a circle. There have been studies shown that it's just more acceptable as a circle. So when you're thinking about your buttons, you want to make sure that the shapes, colors, and labels all provide that clarity. So you're setting expectations and matching those expectations. First thing you always want to do is prioritize the most logical step for your user. But this is never going to be prioritizing the step you want and confusing a user. I want to make that very clear. We're not going to put a sign up button and hide the exit button, because that's a frustrating experience. A user might want to exit, but you want to put that sign up button somewhere they expect and somewhere they're more likely and happier to press, and not frustrating. Labels are really important, and you should make them consistent and actionable. Some bad labels would be something that's not focused on what the user is doing. If you want someone to sign up, don't necessarily say submit. You want them to sign up to a newsletter. So subscribe is a more actionable term. Think very clearly about your labels and make sure it's accessible to everyone. Thinking through the size of the buttons and the color contrast is really important. There are a lot of users who are hard of sight or who have visual impairments, and you want to make sure that it is accessible to everyone and people know what they're looking at and can clearly see it. So minimum sizes of buttons are really important to think about. So we have one more Zoom poll here and wanted to get the user's take. So if your user is reading through a blog article, what are you most likely to click on? What kind of button would you click on after reading a blog? So most people would click on subscribe. And next most is next. Not a lot of people are interested in buy now. And that makes sense for what we usually think of as a blog. And that would be generally what we would say maybe best practice. But I wanted to emphasize that best practice is only as good as your users are to the general public and the general knowledge, because all of these buttons actually might be relevant to that blog, depending on the content of the blog and the audiences. A buy now might actually be relevant if you're an e-commerce site and the blog is about a glowing product review, focusing on one product, talking all about how great that is. Maybe you get some referrals and some influencers talking about it and some quotes. Then usually what you really want is people to buy now. But subscribe is generally used on blogs because it's top of funnel users, educational content, and broad keyword matching for organic traffic. So usually you want people to engage with you and continue to get your email and marketing words. Next would be very appropriate for some things when you're talking about a complex topic and there's a series of steps. Thinking about maybe a first-time home buyer who's researching mortgages, that's going to be a really complex topic. And maybe they're ready to keep reading, but they're definitely not ready to convert yet because they need a lot more decision-making. So buttons impact a huge amount of consumer checkouts when you're thinking about e-commerce, but you can think about this for any industry as well. But specifically for e-commerce, US consumers will abandon purchases at checkout. We know this to be true. That's why we always try and hit them with remarketing. But there are some reasons that a button might affect that checkout. It's either maybe they're creating an account that they didn't want to or didn't expect to, or the checkout process is too long and too complicated. There's a lot of factors that go into this, and you want to understand the user pain points and alleviate that in your UX at all times. So we've talked a lot about a single component, just the button already, but I wanted to give you some touch points of how we measure a button's effectiveness or different elements of effectiveness that you can look at. Of course, you can look at conversion rate. This is definitely a great number to understand and to recognize. You want to figure out where people are coming from, the conversion rate of that button, and make sure you optimize that, of course. But it's also important to start looking at heat maps and understand if they're clicking in the right place. Do you have your buttons in alignment? Is there a high enough contrast and they know what to click and when? As well as audience insights. Surveys, screen recordings, and user interviews can all provide you insight into those user expectations to make sure you're aligning them. And when I say aligning user expectations, I want to make it clear. It's not that you have to do everything your user expects, but you need to set it up so that what your user expects is what you're going to do. So let's zoom out a little bit and let's not look at just a button. Let's look at components, because elements make up components, and these are blocks on your website page. So these can be carousels, they can be video components with a headline and copy CTA, sign up boxes for subscriptions. Your foundational elements are all going to combine. And these are related, and users are going to see them all together, which is what's going to impact them. So remember two things about UX, that users are going to spend most of their time on other websites and not your own. It's very important to recognize that. So your website experience needs to align with their expectations based on all of the other websites they've encountered. And also that the time and effort to make a decision is going to increase with the number of available options. So ideally, you're streamlining this as much as you can. You're not oversimplifying it, but you are going to streamline it and just try and make everything as targeted as possible to what a user needs at that moment and understand where they are. So if you think about a login screen, it's pretty simple for the most part. 90% of the time, and I did pull that number out of thin air, but a lot of the time, a user is going to go in and log in and sign in, unless they're like me and they forget their password all the time, and I do. So I'm always looking for the forget password button, and some users are more like me. Some users don't have an account yet. So there are actually a lot of different elements as soon as the straightforward option is not what a user needs. So the option on the bottom you can see is overly complicated. It's confusing and users don't know where to look. There are users can sign up as two different options, a student or a teacher. There's enterprise sign-ins, there's forget password and forget username. Contact and help are just confusing labels that don't make it clear what they need. So you want to understand and group as many similar elements together and figure out what a user needs to make the next step in the process. So if they're registering, maybe that's all they need to know. Maybe they don't need to say what type of registration they're using at this moment. That can be a next step. So exercises like card sorting can really help you group these elements together. And that'll let you eliminate confusion and simplify the process. But of course, oversimplification is just as dangerous as unnecessary complexity. If I'm logging in, I really need that forgotten password. Please don't remove that, because I will then be lost and I will probably abandon the experience. Understanding eye tracking studies is a great way to make the process more simple for your users. Studies have shown that a single column for a form is going to be easier for someone than having your eyes zigzag, like in the right example, and try and put in all this related information. So thinking through how a user consumes information will really help you, and put your user hat on and look at how you're actually asking the user to go through this flow. And please optimize your labels and don't let them disappear on a form. It's really important to always be able to see the labels. People have many tabs open. You might be going back and forth between different tabs. So you want to have that label very clear. And you want to have as much clarity with your alerts as possible. So having very clear errors and don't have disappearing information. So the other thing I want to really make sure we get across is that strong UX is always accessible and inclusive. It's not just about making sure it's easy to read, but also making sure that everyone's represented here, which is what this example is showing. Having multi-check boxes is often more appropriate than having a radio button for self-identifying options. So those are just a few quick wins you can think about and start getting you in the mindset of users, and some ways to measure component usability in addition to what I've already talked about. But you can look at the abandonment rate for forms. No one really likes looking at a form or filling out a form. It's like standing in line at a grocery checkout, but you really want your groceries and you want to eat. So you're willing to do it as long as the line's not too long. So as long as the form's not too complicated and you're giving a reward at the end, users are going to do it. But as soon as that balance tips, they might abandon it, which is when you look at bounce rate and scroll depth. I do caution these all the time because they are not solid numbers. A bounce rate on a blog is going to be higher than a bounce rate on a checkout page. And that's for a lot of reasons, and it's okay for a lot of reasons. Same with scroll depth. Maybe they got to the next place they wanted to be and they clicked through, and that's why they stopped the scroll. So it's okay if that happens. You need to understand what your page is trying to do and whether your users are successful. And that's why there's a bounce rate, or they're unsuccessful and they're getting frustrated. Same with time on page. This can be a really great indicator, usually in comparison to what it was. So zooming out one more time to pages. Components make up pages, pages make up a website. So these website components are often repeated throughout, and you're going to be reusing them again and again. So it's really important that they come together to make a great experience. So just like we talked about, there's a shared language across websites that you need to keep in mind. Your own website has a shared language. It's teaching your users how to interact with it. And they have set expectations about what might happen when they click a link that looks a certain way. So if you break that expectation, then you're starting to get that misalignment that we talked about. So the more users interact with your brand, the more fluent they'll be in your language. So you want to stay consistent and keep that language. I also always talk about thinking about design debt. If you've ever worked with developers or software engineers, there's a thing called technical debt, and that's when something has been built over and over so many times that there are some things that you had to maybe rush or that just aren't relevant anymore that are still in there. Designs can happen in the same way, and websites often happen in the same way because they're always growing and evolving. So you might look back at a page and realize that's an old component or an old button style that is no longer relevant to our brand. And that's what I would consider design debt. And you want to make sure all of this is aligned and go through and fix your design debt. One of the things I say probably the most is that users scan, they don't read. So only 16% of your users will read every single word, no matter how beautifully crafted it is. So you want to make sure you're always breaking up your content into smaller chunks using those components. But also you want to delight your users. Make sure those components look different from each other. Not only will this add visual interest, but it's going to let them scan easier. They're going to understand that this block, this component on the page is going to have different content than the one that came just before it because it looks different. And I always love to use your headlines to tell your story. If you can tell the story of your page just through the headlines, that'll be a great user experience. People will scan it, see if what they're getting, and then maybe go back and read. In the scannability, you want to avoid false bottoms. This is when the page looks like it's going to end, but it doesn't. So false bottoms will especially hit those scanners really hard, and they're not going to understand that there's more to see there. And always, of course, talking about including clear next steps. You don't want someone to get to the end of a blog post and not have anywhere to go. Direct them somewhere depending on the content of the blog, whether it's to a product page, to a features or a testimonial page or another relevant blog. And answering any doubts, anxieties, and fears. This is an example from Warby Parker. Right during the holiday season, people were worried about shipping. In 2020, it was a huge anxiety. Everyone knew that their Christmas things might come late. So they put that at the top of their FAQs and had a whole section on holiday 2020 and making sure that users knew what they were going to get. Landing pages act as their own ecosystem, and they are important to really consider on their own, but they are not a mini website. They are not having all the information on your website on one page. It is targeted to an audience in their specific place in the user funnel, whether they're coming from remarketing or an organic keyword. So you want to focus on 4 key areas for landing pages: clarity, incentives, friction points, and actions that you want the user to take. And concise and scannable writing has demonstrated a 124% increase in usability when applied to landing pages. So it's great to put all that information there, but make sure it's scannable and concise. And when you're talking about incentives and reducing friction, you want to focus on your user and not your product. Features and values are really important. Features explain what your product does, but values and UVPs are going to sell them to your user. Adding persuasive elements, there's a lot of different ways you can add persuasion with social proofing and ratings, testimonials, and rankings, but you want to make sure you have these persuasive elements. What you don't want is high complexity and cluttered layouts that are unintuitive and that break what people expect to see. This doesn't mean that you can't be creative and that you can't go outside of the box. It just means you need to know the rules and act very intentionally. We do also have a blog post about keeping creativity when you're working within some of these systems. And it's really important to keep that in mind. This is not putting any limits on creativity. It's just understanding how you need to utilize it. So you don't want to have unnecessary distractions or interruptions with the relevant information, of course. The trick of this, of course, is that you can't stop at one design. Websites these days are going to be seen in a variety of different ways on different platforms at different sizes. So one thing I always say is that mobile first is discussed frequently. It's a really hot button term, and it's really important in a lot of ways because mobile does scale very well to desktop, but certain websites should not be designed mobile first because they might be B2B and 80% of their users are desktop users. So as long as you have a strong foundation in UX and you understand and are thinking through the mobile at the same time, you can do desktop first in some cases. It really is what's appropriate for your website and your users and how they're going to be seeing it. So when you talk about measurement of web pages, it gets a little bit more complex. complex, of course, because web pages are more complex. But audience segmentation and baselines, so you can compare, are going to be really important. Audience segmentation includes what type of user you're getting, where they're coming from, and what part of the funnel they are. And having these baselines to compare to and see what the improvement has been will be really important. Same with user polls, time on the site, pages per session. The number and variety of keywords is something that we use for landing pages here at Seer. We look at how many keywords and how broad they are and what landing pages they're going to. If there's a landing page that has too many keywords that go across too many terms heading to it, that's an indication to us that if we break that out to 1 to 2 or 3, maybe even more, that are more targeted to the audience and can target certain keywords a little bit better, that means the content can then be more aligned and those headlines can be more tailored to that audience. So that's something we do when we want to understand when a landing page has grown too big. We also do a conversation heuristic exercise. So when we are talking through, this is a more of a proactive approach, but we can also use it to measure against what has already happened. So it asks questions about friction, what the pain points are for users, where their fears and anxieties may come from, what the unique value propositions for the business are, and want to make sure that that is aligned to what's actually shown on the page. Finally, we get to the bottom of the pyramid, which is the entire digital experience and touch points, because your website is not your only online presence. You're going to have remarketing emails, and you're going to have social posts, not only what you post, but what other people post on your behalf or talking about you. Online partnerships, your search engine results, and your ads all factor into how you're being presented on the website. You can look at a component and a button on its own, but that's never how a user is going to experience it. They're experiencing it, but also the ad that led to it and the form that they're going to be submitting afterward. The customer is a roller coaster. The funnel is not a straight line. People are going to come back, turn around, go again. So it's really rare that someone is going to have a really clean and straightforward approach and never interact with the brand. And that's a good thing. We want someone to get on the roller coaster, go through the loops and the tunnels and the turns, get off the roller coaster, talk to their friends, and then get back on, ideally. So good UX includes time, maturity, and planning for all types of interactions. And they should be answering questions while they're delighting. So it's really important to keep these similar branding elements along a similar path, but we know it's really complex. B2B marketing sales professionals say how challenging it is to integrate brand identity into their collateral. This was in 2021, and 30% said they couldn't, in short, meet brand standards, their brand was undervalued, or there were no uniform brand standards at all, which means the customer experience means there's no uniformity, and you're not getting that shared language. They're not learning how to interact with your brand. The other thing is that 64% of consumers cite shared values as the primary reason they build relationships. So every digital touch point is an opportunity to show those brand shared values and show your branding how important it is. So if you're not incorporating it, because it's difficult, then you're losing a lot of opportunity to convert. So it's, like I said, it's really important to look at the whole experience across a lot of different platforms and a lot of different channels. What you don't want is a button that looks different, saying free trial, going to a landing page that says buy now. Not only does it have a totally different look and feel and can be confusing, but it's not matching expectations, and users are going to be confused or even frustrated. So you want to focus on consistency across aesthetics, tone, and value propositions. When you think about what content you're doing and what you're creating, it's also important to think about the formats it's being presented in. Of course, every page you're going to define, you want these UX components to delight, have variety, be scannable. But you also need to think about what you're presenting. A ton of blog posts might not always be the right approach. You can see that a lot of users found infographics to be really important in the early stages. And same with B2B professionals. When they were researching, they also looked at infographics, mostly at the beginning, but they took 5 to 30 minutes for that. But if you look at what marketers are talking about, what's important to create, They do have blog posts at the top, which is great, but it's a very important step. We found that out. Video, also important. But if you look at infographics, it drops all the way down to the bottom at 3%. So infographics is just one example, but it's a misalignment with what we're producing and what users want to experience. You want a variety of things, and you want the content formats to change so you have that delightful element. When we talk about measuring the full user experience, there are touch points that can give indications, of course, and let you know what to change and maybe when to change or where. So you can look at time to conversion, multi-channel attribution models, customer satisfaction. We did talk about returning visitors and lifetime value, but at the end of the day, it's going to be revenue. That is what we're trying to affect, and that is what the point of a great user experience is, to delight and convert your users. So what I want you to take away from this is that the same rigor that you can use for evaluating a button can be used across the entire user journey. And whether you're thinking at the full scale, doing a huge site redesign, or just trying to figure out what to do with this one tricky button that isn't getting clicks, you should be thinking about all of the UX touch points at once. So making sure you're setting and matching user expectations, understanding your target audience and their current needs, and creating consistency at all levels. So I love customer journey maps because they can show where your UX diverges from what you want the user to experience. And they're really important to look at a high level and then can give that indication of what that button should do.
Right, so it's pretty clear after that that the building blocks of UX stack up to create some pretty complex outputs. For example, a single Lego is a simple thing, but when you set out to build something like the Star Wars Millennium Falcon, which has 7,541 Lego pieces, it gets complicated. You put something in the wrong place, something else is missing, another Lego stuck to the bottom of your foot, and you're left wondering, how can something so simple get so complicated so fast? Well, UX scales in a similar way, and that's why it's the iterative long-term approaches that are most likely to positively impact your business. Just like you can't build the Lego Millennium Falcon in an hour, you can't build a strong UX system in a day or even in a week. Digital ecosystems evolve, businesses changes, user needs and expectations change, everything is changing, and you don't reach a point where your UX is finished. So to continue maximizing on business success, you must make continuous intentional optimizations, and that comes in two forms. The first one being reactive updates, which are identified through performance data outliers that indicate high priority updates. For example, you might work in higher education and you see that your online admission applications are dropping. So knowing that this is a key component to your business, this should result in immediate UX optimizations to solve that specific problem. And these reactive updates should be tackled alongside proactive updates, which are UX changes meant to positively impact your primary KPIs regardless of their performance. So an example for that one would be, maybe you're seeing great conversions from awareness content to a product or service page, but can you make that conversion rate even better, knowing that the digital ecosystem is constantly changing and that UX can always be optimized? All right, so time for another Zoom poll. When do you at your company typically loop in your UX and UI designers into a workflow? Is it at the beginning of a project? Is it halfway through a project? Or do you not have the opportunity to loop designers into a workflow? Oh, that's so exciting to see at the beginning of a project. Looks like a majority of people are looping UX UI designers at the start of a project, and a few are not able to regularly loop in designers. So knowing that timelines and project requirements are constantly changing, that can definitely make it difficult to systematically loop in certain teammates into projects. But it is so incredibly worth it to get those extra set of eyes on a project, as it seems the majority of you are aware of, especially when UX is involved. Because of that, we definitely recommend that you continue to loop UX designers in at a project kickoff so that they can provide feedback and ideas from the jump of a project. Waiting to loop in a UX designer down the road can cause unnecessary revisions or delays because they're sharing valuable callouts that can best be taken into account at the start of a project. And as we know, every company is a digital company, especially with all the changes we've been going through over the past couple of years. We all present digital experiences to users. And because of that, UX requires dedicated resources. Isolated updates often have unintended negative cascading impacts, but by having a dedicated resource, you're ensuring that someone is intentionally thinking through your user experience from that element all the way through to that full experience. But we know that this takes time, it takes money and buy-in, which can be difficult when budgets are tight. But we encourage you to prioritize your UX strategy just as high as your SEO, paid, analytics, and additional marketing efforts, because regardless of how robust those are, if you have a disjointed user experience, your users will not convert. So we're often asked, what is the minimum I can implement to see a positive UX impact? And what we say to that is to look for outliers in your data, look for those reactive update opportunities, and make a UX change that you believe will impact your bottom line the most, using your industry and company knowledge and performance data to inform those decisions. Prioritize those updates on a scale from 1 to 5. 5 being critical issues that directly impact digital usability and revenue, affecting the majority or all of your users. 4 still being critical and impacting revenue, but maybe it's affecting a smaller pool of users. 3 being major issues that don't affect all users, but are still impacting revenue in some way. 2 being minor issues that small groups are being impacted by with lower revenue impacts. And 1 being nitpicky nice to haves that have minor usability and minor revenue impacts. These optimizations can be a combination of proactive and reactive opportunities, but by ranking them on this scale of 1 to 5, you're able to quickly identify a subset of updates that will likely have the largest impact. So all in all, if you're going to take away anything from this webinar, we recommend keeping these 2 ideas top of mind. First, leverage reliable and clean data. Data-driven design is powerful, but only when your data is set up and cleaned correctly. Otherwise, you run the risk of investing in the wrong solution. You need to advocate for reliable data to inform user experience decisions. Changes to your site should be based on the context of your wider business metrics to ensure you're seeing the full picture and making optimizations that are truly moving the needle. And if you aren't a designer, loop in your UX and UI practitioners into your insights and analyses to determine if there's any UX impacts. And second, UX is a large investment, but when done correctly, it results in a larger payoff. Your UX goals, hypotheses, and focuses should be tied directly to business needs in order to show ROI and provide actionable insights and next steps around other areas of your experience that should be optimized. Good UX pulls all of those building blocks into account, again, from a single element all the way through to your full site and your full digital experience. It ties directly to your key performance indicators, and it lays a solid foundation for ongoing iterative optimizations that answer your users' questions quicker and more effectively. Leveraging these building blocks and insights will allow you and your team to unlock the power of effective UX design that not only delights and engages your users, but ultimately drives bottom line impact. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we have 3 questions we can get through. So at the beginning of the presentation, there was examples like a client example wanting to improve their site traffic. Under the short-term solutions, were the custom graphics HTML pages, were those crawlable from an SEO standpoint?
So that's a great question. What we actually did was, alongside with the custom graphics, we created custom landing pages. So those were HTML, they were crawlable, but we created graphics that will support the content on those pages. So you had the scannable headlines, you had the SEO keywords so that they could get that value. But then we also had custom graphics to delight and engage people. And these could be shared on social media. Specifically for this example was Pinterest, because there is a huge user base on that network, and infographics worked very well for this client on that platform. So we did both. And we actually broke up the infographics into a couple of different things. So we could pair it with the headlines, and it wasn't just all infographic and then all content. It was a lot more intermixed.
Best of both worlds. Love it. Anything to add, Sarah?
Andrew did a great job covering all the bases there.
Awesome. All right, we have two more. What's the difference between UX and CRO? When do you need one versus the other?
It's another good question. So for anyone who doesn't know, CRO is conversion rate optimization. And I would say that UX is a tool that can be used for CRO, and it's used as Seer very closely. The creative and the CRO departments work very closely, but conversion rate optimization, you're usually taking a hypothesis and looking at the data to come up with that hypothesis, and then using UX as a tool to get that conversion rate up and form those different tests for the hypothesis. There are some differences in terms of when we're thinking about user journeys as a very holistic thing. Again, UX is really more of a tool to use.
Makes sense. And last one here, and everyone that's still on, feel free to drop any more if you have them, but this is the last one we have so far. Do you need a significant budget in order to scale a UX strategy? Which I feel like a lot of people are curious about.
For sure. So I'd say any amount of budget is worth investing in UX. I know we talked a lot today about the importance of consistent and ongoing UX updates, but any amount of UX support will be beneficial to your site and can be used to tackle low-hanging fruit opportunities with immediate impact if you are more on the lower budget scale. But also something to keep in mind to help you save budget would be investing in UX at the beginning of an initiative, whether it's something like a content migration, incorporating more SEO keywords into your pages, restructuring your site, a site redesign, and so on. Investing in UX at the beginning of a process like that will save you from spending additional budget down the road because you're able to lay that UX groundwork at the onset of a project versus going back and trying to implement UX recommendations after a project has already begun.
And we're also hoping that having some of these foundations and understanding how UX practitioners are thinking through these questions will give you the tools to then advocate for UX and be a champion for it on your own. It can be more than just the practitioners looking at UX and calling out opportunities.
Awesome. And we have one more here. What content formats work best with B2C versus B2B? Are B2C not as likely to put an email in anymore due to privacy concerns? What's the impact there?
So answers often are, it depends on exactly what industry you're in for B2B or B2C, but a lot of things that I've seen work really well that are very engaging for B2C would be something like quizzes and really interactive components, as well as blog posts with great different visuals. They really get people engaged and excited. B2B is a little bit different. Often you're looking at a little bit longer, so reports and white papers have worked really well. In terms of giving an email, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but certainly there can be a little bit of concern with submitting an email. What you usually like to do is make sure there's a little bit of a carrot at the end, so people are more likely to give an email for gated content, something that's proven to be really important to them. So a really in-depth industry report, you can gate that and then capture the email. They're more likely to do that than generally just talking to sales. Not only are the privacy concerns, but they get a lot of emails from B2B a day. So you want to make sure it's worth it for them and you're providing something of value.
Yeah, value exchange is huge for anything related to privacy to overcome. I love these questions. They keep coming in. Like, yes, more. As a client, what are the main things that make it easier to work with an agency on UX and UI?
So I can take a stab, but Sarah, I think I've just answered a few in a row, so chime in at any point. I would say that giving as much information to the UX and UI designers and practitioners as possible is going to make it a lot easier to work with them. We tend to ask for a lot of things, and that's just because we want to understand it and get it as close as we can the first try, and not have to go through too many iterations. It's always an iterative process, but if we know and have as much information upfront as possible, that's going to make it all easier. That would be the big one. I would say that makes it the most easy.
Yeah, for sure. Piggybacking off of what Andrea said, we like to treat our UX designs also kind of like a funnel. So whenever we're sharing UX for a client to look at, we want to get all of their thoughts. Like, Are they happy with the layout? Do they like the content that we've sourced and the layout on the page? Do things scale well from desktop to mobile? And then as we move through rounds of revisions, we're looking for clients to provide less feedback. We make the most feedback at the beginning in the first round. And then as we get closer, it's just like honing in little details like adjusting buttons, moving this a few pixels to the left or to the right, just to maximize on their timeline and their budget and create the most cohesive UX experience possible.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all the questions that we have. As a reminder, everyone will be sending this full recording and the presentation deck via email later on. Really appreciate everyone's time today. Everyone stuck through it the full time, so we appreciate that. And hopefully we will follow up and let you know. We'll follow up. All right. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.